Hey, what's up, guys? Sorry, I was running a little bit late there. I was having some technical difficulties with the live streaming software, but we're all good now. So I just wanted to get back here. So today we're going to be editing these two images. The first one here was sent in by Keyur, and his handle is at Kezzi, Kezzi.w, and his link is in the bio. As well as this photo sent in by Austin. His handle is Austin K. Graph. I put his information also in the bio. So what I'm going to start here. The first thing I want to talk about is the importance of getting the shot right in camera, because when you're relying on post-processing, you really create a lot of work for yourself, and you're never going to get the same result. So in this situation here, Keyur's done a really good job of exposing this image for the backlit conditions here, because as you can see, I can already tell that this image does not need that much work. It's just shot well. So I'd highly encourage you to focus on that as you shoot. So getting started here, what I'm going to do is I think looking at the histogram here, we can see that it does need a little bump in exposure. So I'm probably going to bring it to about right there. And then one other thing I like to do, maybe bring this down just a little bit. All right, there we go. So one other thing I like to do when I'm making these basic corrections is I like to hit the J key on my keyboard. What the J key does is, here, let me do this real quick. So it's telling you the red areas indicate the areas of the image that are pure white. So that's what you're getting these values from here on your histogram. And the blue values are pure black. So that's what these values are here on your histogram. So this just really helps you, shape the image and make those basic corrections to get it even tones throughout. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to boost up the shadows, and as you can see that help moves the histogram, and it also reduces the blue there. You do want some blue and some white in your image, but you just don't want it to be overbearing. So I'm also going to bring up the whites here. So this part of the image, you're going to expect it in a backlit situation to be blown out. We're really focused on this part here. So that's why I'm really cranking these whites here, and I'm not too worried about this over here. But I am going to bring this down just a little bit. And what I'm doing here is, as I'm making these basic adjustments, I'm watching these areas of highlights on her skin, because I'm more concerned with those than these up here. So I think I might bring that down just a little bit. Bring up the blacks, because I noticed that we're getting a little bit, you do want, I would say, probably around right there. Just some parts hitting black, but not too many. So I think bring down, I think right about there is looking pretty good. So let's take a look at the before and the after. So that's before and after, and as you can see, we're just getting a little bit more detail here in the foreground. The sky is about the same, I would say, because it was blown out when it was shot, but that's expected in these backlit scenarios. So the other thing I notice is, when you're shooting backlit, the foreground tends to be colder, especially when you're not the subject's not facing the sun. So you get some nice highlights around the subject, but the subject themselves is a little bit blue. So what I do is I always pop the temperature up a little bit just to bring some of that back. And as you can see, we're just getting a much nicer skin tone and foreground to the image here. And it's also, accentuating those highlights around her. So I'll leave the contrast here alone. I don't typically like to use this contrast that much because I find it to be a little bit muddy. I'm going to bring this down. So one thing I will do when I'm editing these backlit portraits is, because when you're shooting straight into the sun, the lens just inherently loses a little bit of contrast and saturation, and it also kind of creates like this haze. You can kind of see it coming through here on her hair. So what I'll do is I'll just boost this slightly for portraits. So maybe just 2 or 3, just to bring, get rid of that. And as always, I'll bring down the vibrance and saturation. And the reason I do that is because I'm going to be adding quite a bit back with the curves sections here. So I think this is looking pretty good. It's a pretty neutral, flat, well-exposed image. As you can see, the majority of the tones are lying here. These clipping areas for backlit portraits, they just happen because you're going to get a darker spot here and you're going to go super bright here. So it's not too worrisome. So down here in the tone curve, I'm going to drop 3 points, as always. So one thing to watch out for is as you're pulling down on the shadows and the blacks here, is you just want to make sure you're not blowing all these blacks out here so that they're clipping. But one thing I'll do is, in this situation especially, that I think looks nice is I'll bring up the black point here, so it just gives it a little bit of that fade. But another thing it does is it really helps you recover some of these black details. So as you can see, we're getting a little bit more detail here and through here, and then at that point is when I'll mess with the contrast point here. So I think right around there is looking pretty good, and I don't want to lose too much in the midtones there, so I'm just going to set that point back to where it is on the curve, and then I'm going to bring up the highlights to really add that contrast back. So this might be a little too much. So I'm just going to bring this point up here. I think right about there is looking good. So one other thing I'll do is to give it that dreamy film effect is I'll bring the highlight point down just a little bit. You don't want to go too far with it because then your highlights start looking like this mushy gray. But just a little bit I think really helps, because if you look here and you just pay attention to the tree area right here. And as you pull down this point, it just gets a little bit softer and dreamy, I would say. Just make sure. Oops. All right. I was just making sure the stream is going okay, unlike last time where it crashed. So I think that's a pretty good starting point. So there's without the tone curve and there's with. As you can see, it's already making a huge difference. So another thing, let's go into the red here. So with sunset portraits, you're already getting a lot of reds and oranges from the sun. So I don't want to go too crazy with this, but I will bring just a little, probably take a little bit out of the shadows, just a tad, and a little bit back into the highlights, just to warm up her skin tone a little bit there. And as always, I usually go one of two ways with these RGB curves. It's either I'm doing a reverse S curve, so bringing down the highlights and boosting the colors in the shadows, or I am, and that'll make a little bit flatter color contrast. And then if you're doing a traditional S curve, you will raise the contrast of those colors. So as you can see, we're just getting a little bit more depth to the colors here. And all I'm doing is slightly tweaking this, so bringing up the highlight point and bringing down the shadows. And then once we get through the blues here, so I'm going to do the same thing, bring the blue highlights up. You just got to watch it carefully. So I'm watching about right here on her cheek to make sure I'm not messing up her skin tone, because skin tone is king. You can fix a lot of these background colors with brushes and stuff, but if you mess up the skin tone, then you're in trouble. So as you can see, so in this case, as I take out the blues, I'm actually warming up and making that skin tone a little bit warmer. So let's go back to the overall curve here. And as always, if you're not seeing these points, you just click here. This would toggle between these two views. So here's before the tone curve and after. So as you can see, I've just added a little bit reddish orange to her skin tones and just really boosted the color contrast overall. This is why it's so important to desaturate the vibrance and the actual saturation here, or else, let's go back and as if I didn't do this, it just starts, the orange is a little too saturated and a little too much. So I always just start by pulling these out so that I have a little bit more control down here. I think that was right about there. All right. All right, so we're looking pretty good there. So let's overall, there's the before and there's the after so far. So we're going to go down into the HSL here. So I'm noticing that her skin, when I was making those adjustments, got a little red for my liking. So I'm probably going to bring the reds just a little bit over to the oranges. Let's see. Yeah, I think that just makes her skin tone look a little bit better. And then I'm probably going to, let's see. I don't want to go too far to the red. I'm probably just going to leave the oranges where they're at. Let's check out the yellows. A lot of it is just trial and error when you get it down to the HSL, because this changes from image to image. So as you can see here, the yellow, I like them a little bit greener because I think it just blends this back here a little bit nicer. I don't think we have any aquas here. All right, so we're just getting a little bit over here on this and probably a little bit on your shirt right there. So I don't want to mess with those too much, but I don't want them to come through purple like that. So I'll bring them just slightly to the blue. Yeah, same thing. I'm not too concerned about those because I'm going to desaturate them in the next step anyways. So I'm just going to start off with that. Just to make these areas pure white in the photo, I'm just going to crank down the blues, crank down the purples, and the magentas. I don't want to bring down too much of the magentas because there is a little bit of magenta in the skin tone and on her lips, as you see. So if I take that all the way out, it kind of doesn't, you lose that color pop on her lips right here. So I don't want to go too crazy with that. Let's just mess around with, might boost the orange just a tad, just to make her skin a little bit warmer, and this orange glow pop. Don't want, might bring the red down just a little bit so that, because I'm compensating with the orange down here already in her skin, I just want to bring out a little bit of the reds and the purples in this area. The yellow, I might bring up the yellow just to make this area not that much though. That's a little too intense. And the greens, I'll probably desaturate that a little bit so we're not actually, yeah, I'm just going to leave the yellows where they were. But the greens, I just wanted to pull back just a little bit so that we get a nicer roll off here between this yellowy green and this green up here. And last thing, luminance. So her skin, I'm probably going to bring up the luminance on her just so, you know, she stands out a little bit more. Bring down the yellows just a little bit. So we're adding a little bit. So essentially with the luminance here, what you're doing is you're not affecting the colors as much, but you're affecting the brightness and darkness of the color values themselves. So you can actually make certain colors brighter or darker. So like these greens, because most of these greens are in the background, I might want to bring them down just a little bit, because then we'll get the bright subject here and a darker background, so we're getting great depth, and it just adds to that dimension of the photo. Probably going to bring up the aquas, up the blues, up all of these down here, just to make these white areas pop out a little bit more. So this is before and this is after HSL. So it changed a little bit, but as you can see, before it was a little flatter, and now we're adding a little bit more of that contrast back between the background and the subject, and I think it just, you know, like pulls it all together. So one thing I'm probably going to do, like I said, with these backlit situations, the subject gets a little bit colder and grayer. So I'm going to go into the highlights in the split tone, and I'll use these presets that Lightroom has for us. These are just presets for typical filters that you can find that you can physically put on your lens. So this one is a warming filter, and then you have a couple cooling. And I think this one might just be a neutral, but we're probably going to go with one of these warming ones. So thinking that one's a little too red, and then I'm going to go into this yellow one, and it's obviously looks disgusting because it's so saturated, but I'm just going to pull it back a little bit. So let's see. So there's the before and the after, and as you can see, you know, her skin was looking a little cold, so it's just adding back in some of that. And I might, let's see how it looks. So I might go a little redder in the shadows, just to add a little bit of varying tonality to the image. So again, just desaturating that a lot. So I went with this one here, so the redder side, and then this one was a little more yellow. So here's the after, and there's the before. So as you can see, it just adds a little bit more warmth and depth to the photo. I'll probably boost the sharpening a little bit. One thing I do is I always follow a 100 rule where the amount of the sharpening and the luminance always adds up to 100. So in this scenario, it was shot at ISO 100 in good light, so we don't need too much, but you know, you're still going to get some amount of color noise in the image regardless. So I'll just do it a little bit less. So I'd probably do 90-10 here. And let's see if, so as you can see, let me go in a little bit farther. Let's see. All right. So I don't know if you can see too much of a difference here, but I don't know if it's coming through on YouTube, but if you look here, you can really see there's some blotchy patches between the greens and the yellows. So it just kind of looks blotchy, but you're getting some color noises a little bit more up here in this area. And you know, it shows up on skin too. So when I add this 100 rule, as you can see, it just really helped to smooth all that out. And it adds sharpness. So, you know, the subject's gotten a lot sharper, and we've also fixed that color noise issue. So far, again, before and after. So I think this is coming together really well. Like I said, you know, this image was shot well from the get-go. I'm just going to mess around with the profile corrections. So it's recognized this was a Nikon 50-1.8, it looks like. But per usual with these, I kind of don't use that because I don't see, you know, if it was a wider lens, I might use the profile correction just to make sure I'm not getting any weird distortion. But with a 50mm lens, you're not getting too much. And it actually gets rid of a lot of the vignette that I kind of like on the edit. I'm probably going to go in down here in vignette and add a little bit more just to really make her stand out from this background here. And I might actually add a little bit of grain, probably up to around 15. And I typically do this because it just adds a lot more texture to the hair, along with the sharpness when you add just a little bit of grain. And most of the time when you post things on Instagram or Facebook or wherever, you're not even going to notice the grain because it's actually going to get smushed down by the compression algorithm, but it actually really helps to just retain texture, especially once we do some, you know, some retouching of the skin with frequency separation. I might actually bump that up to 20. And as you can see, it's not too crazy. Not adding, you know, we're not going, so it's all grain like that, but, you know, just a little bit. And I usually leave the size and the roughness at default. All right, so I think we're looking pretty good here. And I'm not going to mess with the camera calibration because, you know, it's already looking pretty good to me. So the last thing to do is go over to Photoshop. So I'm going to go right click, edit in, go straight over to Photoshop. If my computer will ever load. Been working on some video files, so I probably have a lot of files cached, so it's going to run a little bit slower. So as always, I just, you know, drag down the background to duplicate it just so I have this just in case. And the first thing I typically like to do is go into levels, and I'll kind of just mess with the levels just to give it a little bit more pop. I don't want to go too crazy with it. Just add a little bit more contrast. So as you can see, there's before and after. It just kind of gets rid of that super flat fade that I added while we're retaining those similar black details. I might have gone overboard a little bit there, so I'm probably just going to dial that back one more. But yeah, nothing too crazy. So then the next thing I will do is I will probably go back to this background layer. We're going to zoom in here. So I'm going to start the skin retouching process. So what I like to do is before I do the frequency separation actions that I have up here, and if you guys don't have a good frequency separation action, there's plenty of videos on YouTube. Feel free to message me and ask me, and I could refer a couple to you, where you can just download the actions and upload it straight to Photoshop, because essentially all the frequency separation actions are the same. So I'm going to go on this background copy here. I'm going to use the Band-Aid tool, or the spot healing brush tool. I just like to call it the Band-Aid tool. And I'm just going to start going through her skin and removing a couple blemishes. I don't like to go too overboard with this. So I'm holding Shift Control Option, and then I'm dragging my mouse left and right. If you drag it left and right, you change the size. If you drag it up and down, it goes with the hardness. So I want it to be pretty hard brush, and about there. So we're just going to go through and remove some of the blemishes, just a little bit. Shouldn't need that much. This is the tedious, not as fun part of retouching. Oops. Like that selection it made, it was bringing in a little bit lighter of a color. Probably clean up a little bit of these stray hairs here. That's one frustrating thing I find when I shoot backlit portraits, is you get a lot of stray hairs, but you know, it really does make a huge difference just to clean them up a little bit. You might notice some of the selections here, but you know, the test is when you zoom out, do you notice it? And you probably won't when we zoom out there. You don't want to be a pixel peeper. Do this one. All right, just a couple there. And I might do this one here, getting some. Just got to be careful to do, especially when you have these light and dark parts. You don't want to drag it all the way across, because it'll get Photoshop will make a weird selection. So just do it in sections. So like for this dark area, I'll only click right there because I know it's going to make a selection probably around those dark areas, and then I'll go up here, finish the rest, and as you can see, you don't really notice it that much. There's one little hair coming across her nose. So as you can see, I just did that in sections just to get rid of it. Take these off right here. I think that's pretty good for the zoom out and see if there's anything else. So it looks like she has a couple scars that or scratches that I'm going to take off too. But most of that will be taken out when we get into the frequency separation part. Just want to do a little bit to help. This is the fun and tedious part of editing, but it has to be done. So let's see, let's just take out a little bit of these. These I'm just going a little bit crazier because I know I'm going to run over this with the mixer brush in a minute during the frequency separation. I think that's pretty good. All right, so as you can see, there's a before, there's an after, and then before, so we just kind of removed some of these hairs, cleaned up the skin a little bit. And next step, I'm going to go over to frequency separation. I'm just going to run this action. So as always, you just want to go into the Gaussian blur here. I typically like to find an area on the cheek, and I'll just dial this in till, because like right now I can see the difference in texture here, so you just want to blend it, raise the radius until all of that color difference goes away. So probably around 9 there, because as you can see, it's a very smooth transition. All right, so once we get in here, and a Photoshop, a video specifically for frequency separation will probably explain this a little bit better, but a quick rundown is frequency separation is separating your photo into a color layer in the low frequencies here, and then in the high frequencies, so if we turn everything off here, you can see that it's only giving the texture of the image there. So you're just getting the textures, and then if you turn off these layers and you turn back on these, you're just getting the color of the image without any texture. It's just flat. So typically when I'm doing frequency separation, I like to turn off these texture layers, because then you can really see, as you're blending with the mixer brush, the color tones, and making sure you're getting a smooth transition between all of the colors. So I'll go over here to my brushes and I'll right click and I'll get to the mixer brush tool. So what I want to do is just make sure I typically set my wetness at 2. You can leave these 2 at default and the flow around 15. If I had a Wacom tablet or something, I would probably make the flow a little bit less and paint a little bit more, but because I don't like moving my mouse around all the time, I have my flow a little bit higher. But you just got to be conscious that the more you move, the smoother it is, and the faker it's going to look if you go too much with it. So I just got to blend that out there. It's just very subtle. I'm just blending it until so you're not getting such harsh sections of the color. Just gonna do it pretty heavily on the hand. I typically like to smooth out a lot of the tendons and things. It just looks a little bit smoother. Go over this. Frequency separation is also good for, I know a lot of models are conscious of arm hair, so it's pretty good to tone that down. Let's go over the back of the hand here. I don't want to go too much on the hand. I'm going to lose all that detail, but just on the back here, where you get veinier sections. But I think that's probably about all it'll do. And then I'll turn off that layer just to double check. So I think maybe, so at this point I'll just fine tune it with both layers on. I think it just needed a little bit more around here. So as you can see, here's the before and there's the after. So I just like to do it very subtly, nothing too crazy. This is where I see a lot of people, especially on Instagram, go a little overboard because you need some texture to make them not look cartoonish. All right, so there's the after, there's the before, there's the after. So very subtle change. Also helps to lighten the face a little bit. All right, so let's zoom out here. So overall, I think it's looking pretty good. One of the last things I'm going to do is I'm going to add some dodge and burn layers. So to do that, you can make an action. I have a dodge and burn action up here. But what I will do is I'll just show you how to make it from scratch, just to be okay, so we'll label this one burn. And I'll make another one, curves layer, and dodge. All right, so I'll crank this one down a lot. It's going to be ridiculous, and then you hit Command I just to remove it, to invert it. This one, I just typically raise the midpoint here. Pretty crazy, but you don't have to worry because you can always bring back the opacity of the layers themselves. So then I'll hit B on my keyboard. It's just a shortcut to get back to the brush tool. Then what I'll do, so with the burn layer, let's check this. All right, so let's go, let's dial back the opacity. Actually, let's bring up the opacity just so I can see what I'm doing, and I'll just subtract the flow, bring this down to about 10%, just so we're not going too crazy. So with the burn, I'm going to frame up the face here. Just follow the face, add a little bit, and I like to do the darker part of the arms. This just really helps it pop, and it's going to look a little crazy. I have it on super dark just so I can see where I'm going, but ultimately I'm going to bring back the opacity of the layer, so not to worry. Oops. Just doing a lot around the face there. The arms, just to add a little bit more depth. Alright, I think that's looking pretty good. So as you can see, there's after and before. It's crazy, but all I'll do is I'll just bring the opacity back so that it's a lot more subtle. So as you can see, it's not as crazy there now. All right, so then go to the dodge layer. And you can sit and go through the dodge and burn for quite a while, but I'm going through this pretty quick just for the sake of time because I know you don't want to see me sit here and just fine-tuning this. But so what I do is I like to, so you want to simulate, see the light is hitting her from here. That's where you're getting these highlights. So we ultimately want to keep that light pattern, but just kind of clean up some of these darker areas. So make it around her eye to make it pop a little bit more, around the cheek. Typically people have a shadow around here on the lip that I'll clean up a little bit too. Just kind of helps the lips stand out a little bit more. And then I'll ultimately go over the top parts of the arm here just to make them pop a little bit more as well and add depth. This is the part of photography that is very, it's contouring. It's like painting. And then just like last time, just crank it back. This one I don't like to crank back as much because the burn gets a little crazy, but the dodge is okay, typically. All right, so there's the before and there's the after, just very subtle. So then we'll zoom out here on the image and I'll show you where we're at. So let's make a group of all of these. So this is the before and there's the after. So just very minor adjustments in Photoshop. And one of the last things, just to really sell this warm sunset glow, is I'll probably add a gradient map. And I'll choose one that has some nice gold warm tones, probably this gold 1 here. And you can mess with the blend modes. I typically like to go with multiply or soft light. So soft light's going to add a little bit more color contrast, and multiply is just going to add a little bit more color. But ultimately, so in this case, I'm probably going to go with multiply. Let me see what soft light. Actually, I think I like the soft light one better. Okay. And then one last thing I do is typically when you take your photo back from your computer to another device, it gets a little darker. So I typically just brighten it up a little bit just to compensate for that. If you've ever noticed, your photo looking different between your computer and your phone, it has a lot to do with the color space and just the brightness at which you're editing it on a larger screen to a smaller screen. So it's typically okay to just bring up the exposure just a little bit more than you think. So I think that's looking pretty good right there. And I'm probably going to stop there. So yeah, that's it for this one. I'm going to check if you guys have any questions. Oh, it's Kezi. Pop out the chat here. All right, so I'm just going to keep that one open. So this next photo, typically I only go into Photoshop when I am editing portraits with landscapes, because you can go a little bit harder on, and it doesn't require as much control, I would say, to not mess up skin tones and stuff like that and all the frequency separation. I just typically edit all of my landscapes right here within Lightroom, unless I need to remove anything. So the removal tool here in Lightroom is honestly pretty weak. It'll give you some really blotchy areas, but like I said before, it's only what you notice when it's all the way zoomed out. So this one is by Austin. It's here in Washington, D.C. I can tell just by the colors of the row homes here. We had a snow day a little bit ago. So with snowy pictures, you always get a bluer cast on the photo. So let's see. So let's just zoom in here. I just want to see something. Okay, so yeah. So you're always going to get a little bit bluer of a cast, bluer gray. So we're just going to change the white balance up here. So what I was just doing is I was zooming in to look for a good gray point, because to balance the white balance of the photo, you want like around 18% gray is what is the standard for color balance. So I was just, so that right there, so I was choosing these gray right in here, and if you use the little dropper, brings it up. So I was just reading the RGB of it. So yeah, you don't want to go for the pure white areas like that, because then your white balance will be too warm. Just kind of pick one. See, I'm just trying to find an area that's not too dirty from the snow of the car driving over it. Let's try up here. I'm just going to manually adjust it now. I think one more bump in. Okay. I think that's right around there. So as you can see, that was just all we've done is mess with the white balance. And so there's the before and there's the after. This is just a little bit truer to life, I would say. This is a little bit blue and colder. So the next thing I'm noticing is the whites are looking a little bit flat. And that just happens on these gray overcast days where you're not getting the pop from the sun. So like before, I'm going to hit J, and I'm just going to really crank on the whites here. It's okay if it blows out up there, because it's just going to add more contrast to that tree anyways. I'm just going to bring down the highlights just to get rid of a little bit of that so we don't get any weird fringing. I'm also going to pull down the blacks until I start seeing some of this blue here. You can also hit, let me try and remember which ones. I think it's Alter Option. yeah, if you hold down Option, it kind of isolates the black points for you, just so you can see. So we just want a little bit like that. And the same thing with the whites. We don't want it to be super white. A little bit of that blue is okay. So we're probably good about there. So I'm going to turn the J key off. So as you can see, let's see if we can pull up some. Probably want to pull up the shadows a little bit too. I forgot to do that. I don't want to go too much because then you start getting this weird fringing haze with the highlights around the trees. So just a little bit. Okay, so here's what we're, with the basic adjustments, there's the before and there's after, so we've made progress. So this is one thing I vary between my portraits and my landscapes. I'll actually add 10 clarity. I always add 10. I don't, I always add 10 or -10 for portraits. It's just a good starting point. And I'll actually usually add dehaze because what the dehaze, like I said before, it cuts a little bit of the reflections of the lenses, and it also just brings a little bit back of the color saturation. It especially helps on these gray days to make the colors a little bit more vibrant. And like before, I'll probably bring down the vibrance here, the saturation here, because we're ultimately going to bring that back in the tone curve. So with landscapes, I do 3 points typically. And these I'll go much, much harder on than I do with the portraits. So as always, I do a pretty similar curve. So I'm seeing that the highlights are a little, after I added that curve, I'm probably going to have to make an adjustment, but I'm just going to bring down the whites because I'm seeing that they're just a little bit overpowering here. Okay, so probably bring up this point here just so we're not crushing these blacks too much and we're getting a little detail there. All right. So there's the before, there's the after. So the next thing we'll do, so go into the RGB curves here, and like I said with these, so this is all trial and error. It's going to look very crazy, but I'll generally do some S curves in here just to get an idea, and then I'll fine tune it later. But if you know, with the portraits, I only slightly pull these, but you know, as you can see in this situation, I'm adding a lot of contrast back. So I'm probably going to take off this clarity, even because I'm noticing getting a little bit, this was already a pretty contrasty scene, a little bit more contrasty than I noticed. So I typically start with the 10, but that doesn't mean I always end with that, because I'm noticing once I added the color contrast in here. So this is looking pretty good, but I'm kind of noticing there's like a greenish yellow tint here, so I'm going to go back into the greens. I'm going to just mess with that. So I'm going to pull down the greens and the shadows, and as you can see, that kind of took off that tint there. The whites are looking pretty good, just very blown out. So I'm going to hit the J key one more time. So if you look at the histogram here, we're getting some white clipping. So I'm just going to pull down on these a little bit more. And also pull down on the highlights. All right, so I think that's looking good right about there. I typically edit, I've always done this, I don't know why. I've always edit my landscapes to be really contrasty. So I notice this is very contrasty, but I think it just helps, you know, define some of the colors and just, you know, makes the image pop. I might take off this dehaze because I don't know what camera this was shot on, but it looks like it's a JPEG, so it's not a RAW file, so I wasn't getting as much flexibility. So with the JPEG, what it's, you know, the difference between JPEG and RAW is JPEG's applying the software of, well, in the software of the camera itself, it's applying a preset for contrast, saturation, all of those values, and it hardwires it right onto the image. So when you're doing raw, it's taking all that off, and that's why you get that flat picture. But because this is a JPEG, it's already added some contrast, so that's probably why I'm trying to pull back on this clarity. I might even go back on the dehaze just a little bit, just to negate a little bit of what that camera manufacturer is doing. Might even want to say this is a phone. I'm not sure. Regardless, this is a phone. It's very good quality. But okay, so next thing that's bothering me a little bit is I see around these trees we're getting some color fringing. I don't know if this is coming through, but it's just a little bit of purple and green fringing. So I'm just going to pop down here. Okay, yeah, I think this is definitely a phone because it's saying 3.99 millimeters, which I don't think, maybe if it doesn't have a profile. Wow, if this is a phone picture, phone cameras have come a long way. Anyways, I'm going to do what I traditionally do. I'm going to add a little bit of vignette, and it just makes, you know, this tree and this scene in the middle pop a little bit more. Add a little bit of grain for texture. Gonna do the 90-10 rule because the lighting was pretty good here as is, and that just helps routine. So this is the before, and that's the after. So I'm just really, you know, with these snow pictures, you know, one of my favorite parts of editing snow pictures is I like to, you know, really make those whites bright, because when you do that, you kind of blow it out a little bit and you lose all this, you know, texture in the snow, but it just really adds to the contrast of the photo with the colors here and the darker areas. And another thing I like to do, and this is just a style thing, I don't even think we need to do much HSL here because I think these colors are looking how I'd want them. I might desaturate to get rid of a little bit of this brown. So just because I don't like this brown here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this tool here, and I'm going to just pull back on that. So it's looking like the oranges and the yellows. So I'm just going to pull that out a little bit just to, and what that does is it just really helps to, so as you can see there, all we've lost is this pop of the sign, which is pretty distracting anyways. So, but it's just got rid of that brown aspect. So it's, now you just focus mainly on the contrast here and the color pop here. Another thing I like to do is sometimes, you know, with sunset or golden hour photos, I'll add a warmth to the highlights, but these I kind of like to add bluish tints. Yeah, so this is like a bluish gray here. I think this is looking pretty good. I'm just going to pull it down a little bit. So there's the before of, oops, there's the before of that, and there's the after. So what that's doing is it's adding a little bit of blue back in without losing the warmth of these right here. That so if you would have just added that blue by trying to change your temperature, you would have, these colors would have been a little bit different. So I like to do it in the split toning there. Let's see. I might try and add a warmer color. Yeah, like this one. Because if I add a warmer color, so if I'm adding in the highlights, so your snow is going to be in the highlights here, and then all these darker parts are going to be in the shadows. So what I like to do to get some pretty good contrast is I will make the highlights a little bit bluer, and this is for typically what I do for snow photos, and then I'll add a little bit of warmth to the shadows just to, you know, get a little bit of different contrast. So there's the before and there's the after. I might bring down the saturation of these the blues and the highlights a little bit. But yeah, I think ultimately that's about all I would do. I spent a little bit of less time editing on landscapes because I feel like you don't have to fine tune them as much. But so here's the before and there's the after. I definitely think it just makes the snow pop. We got great saturation and contrast in the scene. Yeah, and thank you guys so much for watching. If you want me to edit your photos in the future, first of all, please like and subscribe down below to see more of these videos, and leave a comment of how you think I did today. But if you want me to edit your photos, please send them into the email. I put it in the description of the video. And yeah, see you guys next time. Thank you guys so much for watching.